it. So getting into the big picture comparison between 2011 and 2018, this is the summary slide. If you see, I'm sure people attending this session today are already familiar with 2011 version, which is on the top. This is a diagrammatic representation of 20,000, 2011. And below the lower part, if you see, is a representation of how 2018 looks like. So if you see on the top diagram, the customer interaction remains the same. So if you see on top, customers used to provide service requirement, and in return, they used to receive services. Currently also, your service management system continues doing the same. There is no change. So customers provide requirements and receive services in return. However, if you see the structuring of it, it has gone through sea change. So if you see, I'm looking at the 2018 version, I'm looking at the diagram, and I'm looking at the top point which says 4, clause number 4. So if you see, clause number 4 talks about context of the organization. Now, I'm sure all of you understand this is a welcome introduction that has happened in 20,000. So just to give you a background, 20,000 was structurally, it was different from ISO 9000 and ISO 27,000. Now, if you know, ISO 9000, by the way, takes care of quality management system of your organization, and 27,000 takes care of information security management system. So now if you see in a service management organization, if you consider any IT org who is a service provider and decides to go for 20K, as well as 9K and 27K, because these all three are pretty important to any organization whatsoever. What used to happen is 9K and 27K structurally they were the same. Each one started with a context setting, then they talked about leadership, then they spoke about how the organization planning should happen, and then they spoke about what should be the supporting elements to make sure that you succeed. And then they got into the operational details and then went to performance evaluation and improvement. So a complete PDCA cycling. This was pretty logical and it is easy. So now if you implement 9K and 27K, for you, maintenance, implementation, audits, regular improvements would be pretty, comparatively much simpler, because of the fact that they are the same structure, structurally same. When it comes to 20K, it's a different ballgame altogether. In 20K, the approach is a bit different. It starts, the contexting is not really a criteria. You rather, of course, contexting is important, we all know, but it was not a spelled out requirement. So because it's not spelled out, at times I had seen environments where it's pretty theoretical, whatever has been implemented. So that was a challenge. Leadership, of course, was covered, but not in the same format. So format wise, it was very different. And because of that, it was very difficult to maintain it. It was like you are maintaining two different structures. So ISO decided to create this structure that you see starting from 4 to 10, which is the typical structure of any other ISO popular for standards like 9,000 and 27,000. So now in any organization, if they decide to implement all three together and create an integrated management system structure, it will be comparatively way easier. So that's a welcome gesture. On the other side, let me tell you, this contexting is important, because just imagine what is good for me may not be good for you. The way I implement something in my organization may not be the same case in yours. So we all understand that our context, our business environment, our organizational logic are different. And that's why, so my organization is a small 30 people team. In your organization, it might be hundreds or thousands of employees. So naturally, so the financial capability for my organization is very different than yours. So naturally, unless we consider those contexts and design the IT service management or service management system in that way, it is very difficult for you to create something which is giving you business value or giving you organizational value. So considering that, contexting is the first and foremost step. You need to do context setting, and then based on that, you need to jump into practices. Now, ISO 20K has recognized that. Earlier also, by the way, we used to do contexting, but it was not clearly spelled out, as I said. Now it is done. So that's a good input. Then if you see, there is a new There is a layer called leadership. Needless to tell you, earlier, if you look at the diagram of 20,000, 2011, the top diagram, you see the top point saying Service Management System, SMS, clause 4. Below that, if you see, there is a line item called Management Responsibility. So management responsibility, governance of processes, documentation management, resource management. So many of these things were there. So if you see that management responsibility, is very similar to what you see here as leadership. So terminologies have changed, structure has changed, but the main crux remains, they have changed, but the main crux remains very similar. Moving on after leadership, if you see there is a planning section that has been introduced now. Here, when we talk about planning, we are talking about planning the service management system, the overarching setup that you put on your organization. And then if you see there is a support to the SMS is a separate section that has been a clause that has been developed called 7.0. This support piece talks about providing you resources, giving you, making sure that competence, awareness, etc. are established in your organization. The knowledge, when I say knowledge, knowledge base, etc. By the way, this knowledge piece is a new introduction again to 2018. Earlier, it was not categorically spoken about in 2011. Knowledge bases have been always important, but it was never called out this way. Now it's separately called out and spoken about. Knowledge, when I say, I mean knowledge of your entire environment. That means that includes your overall people knowledge, at the same time knowledge of individuals, at the same time knowledge bases and so on. Good. So after support, then we move to operation. Now this is the meat of the discussion. So if you see earlier, in 2011, it was divided into 4 parts: 6, 7, 8, and 9, 4 clauses, right? All these so-called ITSM processes, which we are aware of. Now, if you see operation of the SMS 8.0, here you would see the same processes are listed, but the structuring has been changed. Now, 8.0 has been divided into 6 parts, namely service portfolio is a separate set of processes, relationship and agreement is a separate set, supply and demand is a separate set, service design, build and transition is a separate set, resolution and fulfillment is a set, and then service assurance is a set. So these are sets, and under each, if you see the same old processes, but then because that's the superset, but then there are certain changes. Like, let me take you through. If you see service portfolio, the first set, we talk about service delivery. So service delivery as a separate process has been recognized. Planning the services. So if you see, there are 2 plannings. Here you see plan the services. And if you see under clause 6.0 planning, that's a separate planning altogether where you plan the entire SMS. So service management system, the central canopy planning is under 6.0, and under service portfolio, you have service planning. Then of course you have another clause or process called control of parties involved in the service life cycle. So if you notice, this is the same thing that I was talking about a few minutes back. In 2011 version, this was called as governance of processes operated by other parties. If you see under 4, so that has now been, if you see, they were talking earlier, they were talking about governing the processes that are being operated by other parties. Now they are saying don't govern the processes, govern the parties themselves. So control the parties. How would you control? The details are provided. And then if you see, service catalog management has been introduced now. Earlier also, by the way, guys, service catalog management was present in ISO 20K, but there was just one clause, and that was embedded in service level management under clause 6. So you never saw it separately. Now what they have done is they have taken that clause out and given it its due respect and called it as a separate process. So service catalog management is there. Then if you see asset management and configuration management, earlier configuration management, in 2011, the configuration management clause had asset management embedded in it as a very, very thin one-line, single-liner bullet point. Now that has been recognized and it has been taken out as a separate clause altogether. Again, in a very generic way, because it's just the introduction, and asset management arguably may not be a direct ITSM process as such, but we all know that the environment has changed, and asset and config both play major roles. So yes, so that recognition has been provided and taken out. Then going to relationship and agreement, if you see, there are two parts. There are three processes. Sorry, business relationship management continues, is the same business relationship process that we had discussed earlier in 2011. Then you have service level management. If you see, service level management earlier, as I told you, was much bulkier. Service level management earlier spoke about three things. It spoke about SLA, it spoke about OLA. OLA is the agreement between you and your internal groups. And so SLA, OLA, and then it also spoke about service catalog. So now all these three has been separated. SLA is a part of service level management now, continues to be. OLA has been put under supplier management. So don't get surprised, just bear with me. So supplier management now has OLA under them, and excuse me, and excuse me, and service catalog is a separate process called service catalog management. Now let me explain the OLA part. So coming to supplier management. So supplier management is now, it's a little strange to me at least. Supplier management has been modified further. We used to know that the definition of supplier is any third party which is outside of your organization. Now that definition has been changed. Now it says that supplier is anyone beyond your core service provider team who helps you. So it could be now internal supplier and external supplier. When you say external supplier, it's the same good old vendors or suppliers of yours. When you say internal supplier, it's actually your internal teams or your customer who may also be a supplier to you for certain reasons. So now, because it now is divided in two parts, external supplier and internal supplier, the external supplier part remains the same, it has not changed, but the internal supplier piece now talks about OLA. It says internally, any group you're dependent on, which is not your direct delivery group, you need to make sure that you have an OLA established. So if you notice, the policy has not changed. OLA remains OLA, but only change is it's no more, OLA is no more a part of service level management, but supplier management. By the way, I am aware that if you are coming from an ITIL background, you are finding it difficult to accept it because in ITIL, we talk about OLA as a part of service level management. I personally am a big proponent of that. But then this structuring has been done for various reasons, not questioning that. But ultimately, this is a change. So nothing has changed as such in terms of the clause content, but the only thing that has changed is the structuring. Then you have supply and demand. In that you have budgeting and accounting remains exactly the same. Demand management and capacity management. So earlier, capacity management, let me highlight that. In earlier capacity management, we used to say that you need to create a capacity plan at the beginning of the year. And that planning, whatever plan you create for capacity, should come from you identifying what are the capacity requirements. But as we all know, capacity requirement gets derived from whatever demand you identify in the customer environment. But the demand management was not separately spoken about. So we used to assume things. We used to assume that demand management also needs to be played. I mean, we need to identify what demand we have from the customer environment. And accordingly, we need to derive if this is the demand. So for example, we need to go and speak to the customer about, let's say, ticket volume. We need to understand from them what will be the ticket volume next year. What is the demand? After we understand their demand expectations, if they say this year you are getting 10,000 tickets a month, next, or let's say, yeah, 10,000 tickets a month, next year you might get an increase of 30%. Then our job was to convert that into our capacity need. So what does it mean? How many more employees do I need? What tools do we need extra, and so on and so forth. So the derivation used to be done without really calling it out as demand management. Now that has been called out. So there are two different processes now. Demand management says that you need to periodically connect with your customer, gather their demand expectations for your services. And then capacity management says that now whatever demand you're getting, you need to then get it converted, excuse me, converted into capacity requirements, and accordingly design the whole thing end to end. Pretty interesting. And it's truly appreciable that the demand management process has been introduced. Good. Moving on, service design, build and transition. So if you see change management remains change management, no great changes, just the same.